By now you've probably already seen Stefan's first look at the Ioniq 5 shot a few months ago, but now I have finally gotten my hands on it. I haven't been able to drive it yet, but let's take a look around and see what makes the new Ioniq 5 one of the most interesting EVs that's going to be on sale a little bit later this year. Lately, Hyundai has a definite love for angles, and it's obvious not just in the new Tucson, but also in the Ioniq 5, but in an entirely different and unique way. The headlights have these really cool daytime running lights, these square U-shapes right there, and then there's a lot of daytime running light accent running across this section of the bumper. Everything here is definitely designed with aerodynamics in mind. There are a lot of smooth surfaces, not a lot of openings, and there's not a lot of cooling required in an EV, so the only intakes are right down here at the very bottom of the bumper. One of the most interesting things about the Ioniq 5 is its size. In photos, this looks smaller than it really is for some reason. This platform is going to serve as the basis for a host of new EVs from Hyundai and, of course, their sister company, Kia. The EV6 is going to be relatively closely related to this. And because those EV plans include future three-row vehicles, this is pretty big. It has a wheelbase that is longer than the Hyundai Palisade, and overall, it's nearly as long as that three-row crossover. But the way that they've styled it, it looks a little bit smaller, except if you're standing right next to it. As with many modern EVs, this has a relatively sloping rear profile, so if you were hoping for a really square EV as far as this portion of the design goes, you may be a little bit disappointed. But I have to say, I love the rear end design. They have these multi-module matrix LED lights back here. The taillights and brake lights are in this area, and then the backup lights are right over here inside the middle. This is where the Ioniq 5's magic really starts to show. And I'm not talking about the charge connector, which is just a regular J1772 connector, or what is below, that's the CCS DC fast charge connector, or even this cool little array of lights that tells you how charged the battery is. I'm talking about how fast the Ioniq 5 can charge. When this goes on sale a little bit later in 2021, this will be the world's fastest charging EV, thanks to a new 800-volt system on board. According to Hyundai, this will charge the 77.4 kilowatt-hour battery pack from 10% to 80% in just 18 minutes, if you have access to an 800-volt, 350 kilowatt charger. Those are going to be all of the big Electrify America stations around the United States. And if you don't have access to an 800-volt charger, they do something really interesting with the battery that we don't see in the other 800-volt system available on the market, which is shared between Audi and Porsche. In that particular system, you have to check a relatively expensive option box if you want to charge faster at some of the older CCS charge stations. This vehicle has the ability to separate its battery pack out and deliver to the charging station access to the 800-volt battery pack in two 400-volt sections. So this will be able to charge at full speed on those older chargers without any additional accessories, or if you have access to the faster charger, at over 270 kilowatts. Hyundai has not been exactly specific on the charge rate of this, but it's going to be somewhere upwards of where we see the Porsche Taycan. When designing the Ioniq 5, Hyundai decided to put a little bit less emphasis on under-hood storage. That may make some EV shoppers a little bit sad because under here we just have a fairly small storage compartment where you could put perhaps your level 1 charge cable, and that's because there's still a lot of stuff that has to live under the hood of an EV. The air conditioning, the front electric motor if you choose the all-wheel drive version, the windshield washer pump, coolant, all that sort of stuff has to live somewhere, and that somewhere is under the hood. So instead of giving us a long hood profile that takes up a lot of interior space and a front trunk, they decided to give us more cargo space in the back and then just tighten up the dimensions. In terms of motors, there are going to be two different options, rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. The rear-wheel drive model gives you 225 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. The all-wheel drive model bumps that up to 320 horsepower and 446 pound-feet of torque. Range is going to be pretty good in this, even though the battery is smaller than some of those other newer EVs that we're going to be seeing soon. If you get the rear-wheel drive model, they're saying 300 miles of EPA range. If you choose all-wheel drive, 269, which is pretty similar to what we see in the Ford Mustang Mach-E, except that this battery pack is at least 10 kilowatt hours smaller. That means this is going to charge faster, it's going to gain range faster, and it's going to cost you less to drive. One of the most interesting features in the Ioniq 5 is the driver's seat, which has a really extreme recline functionality and a built-in ottoman on the front. Obviously, that's not designed for you to use while you're in motion. Instead, it's designed for you to use while you're DC fast charging, because manufacturers are starting to realize that sitting there for 20 minutes doing nothing is pretty boring, and in the Ioniq, they've decided to make it a more relaxing place for you to spend your time, use your tablet, your computer, etc. Because even though we do have two big screens in front of us here that you're going to see in a bit, we don't have any built-in features like Netflix or Hulu streaming or anything like that. We do have a new steering wheel design with a tilt telescopic steering column, a large range of motion, and an incredibly spacious interior. Because this has a skateboard-style battery pack, the floor can be completely flat, and that gives you an awful lot more room on the inside, visually and of course practically as well. The size of the Ioniq is also apparent back here in the back seat. This front seat's comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. I have about 7 or 8 inches of legroom left. This is the kind of vehicle that you could very comfortably accommodate child seats behind a tall driver up front. Absolutely no problem. Scooting all the way over to the right of the vehicle, you can see the kind of room we have back here. And the rear seats have a recline functionality as well. These offer about 6 inches of recline. You can also square off the cargo area by putting them a little bit more upright, right like that. And the panoramic moonroof extends to almost over the rear passengers' heads. This sheet of glass does not open, but you can see that the roller style cover does block the light completely, which is something that I like. And the bifold feature is kind of an interesting touch. We have rear window shades back here and a lot of really high quality materials, even in the rear. Thanks to the size and the squareness of the Ioniq, we have a pretty decently sized cargo area back here, although it is not as square as the cargo area that you'll find in the Santa Fe or the Tucson. And as with every other EV out there, aerodynamics are the likely reason for that, of course, because in order to have an aerodynamic profile, you can't really have a really sharp truncated end like a 1990s Volvo station wagon. You generally have to have the kind of shape that we find in this and most other modern EVs. But Hyundai has done a really good job of keeping the roofline pretty high towards the rear, and that's not something that we see in the Tesla Model Y or the Ford Mustang Mach-E. Because the battery pack is completely under the vehicle, we have some additional storage space right here under the load floor. There's about 4 inches of additional space, although oddly enough, this is where Hyundai chose to put the subwoofer right there. I'm kind of surprised it's right in the middle. They theoretically could have located that perhaps off to the side, but you still have access to a lot of additional storage area under here. The interior design is likely previewing what we're going to see in other upcoming Hyundai models. We have this large sheet of glass that goes to just about over the rear passengers' heads, but stops just short of those headrests. The rear windows are nice and large and very upright. They have window shades integrated into them right there. Height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and two-way adjustable headrests. Hyundai is really focusing on recycled content, recyclability, and other environmental concerns with this interior. So you don't find leather upholstery in here. Instead, we find imitation leather upholstery, which I think is done really well, with a lot of some of the accents that we're seeing in other Hyundai models, like a combination of imitation leather and fabric. So you can see fabric welting right there, fabric on the back of the seat that really dresses things up. Moving over to the door panels, we have a combination of imitation leather fabric and what I guess is sort of like Formica that reminds me a little bit of imitation granite countertops with interesting square design there. You can see ambient lighting, that's that purple glow behind the armrest and grab hold there. Moving over to the dashboard, we have a very, very horizontal dash design, which really accentuates the two large screens in the dashboard, one for the instrument cluster and one for the infotainment system. This infotainment software is basically what we see in other Hyundai and Kia models. It has been ever so slightly tweaked for use in the EV. An interesting twist versus some of Hyundai's other green vehicles is that some controls are now only inside the infotainment system, like the seat heating and ventilation. Rather than having a ton of buttons lower on the center console, they've actually started to remove buttons, which is a bit of a twist from what we see in vehicles like the Hyundai Nexo. Down at the bottom of the dashboard, you can see we have storage areas down there, that completely flat floor right there, two very big cup holders, bunches of USB ports, wireless charger, more storage areas going on there, and this center console. This can be lifted up out of the way to give you even more room in the middle. Or if you want, it can be opened up so that way you can put some small knickknacks inside, and then they will all stay safe as it stashes towards the rear. Moving back to the driver's side, we again find that full LCD instrument cluster. The style is a little bit different versus what we see in other Hyundai products, but again, it's not quite as configurable as what you'd expect in a modern Mercedes. Over here on this side of the steering wheel, we have infotainment controls, some favorite buttons, things like that. On this side, we have the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system. They are illuminated. They're a little bit difficult to show on camera. The shifter is this interesting little stalk right here that does not move with the steering wheel. We toggle this section around like that for drive, back for reverse, and then park is that P button right there at the end. There's an EV start stop button right over there. There are regen paddles on the back of the steering wheel. I love that design. And then behind the steering wheel, you can see that Hyundai is debuting a new stock design. These are for the headlights over here on the left side, and then for the windshield wipers over there on the right. If you're wondering why there's a business card on the right side of that instrument cluster, you can think of this area sort of like a cubicle wall in an office. There's a metal panel behind the fabrics. That way you can stick things to that fabric with a magnet. So if you have smartphones or other things that you want to be able to stick there, or post-it notes or things like that, you can do that there. Then we have large air vents below. Now, unfortunately, at this point, I have no idea how much the Ioniq 5 is going to cost, but Hyundai has been pretty upfront that this is not exactly targeting the least expensive EVs available in the US. So this is not a replacement for the Kona EV. Instead, they're targeting vehicles like the Mustang Mach-E or the Tesla Model Y or other upcoming EVs with about 300 miles of range and obviously over 300 horsepower. So this is quite logically a direct competitor to something like the Volvo XC40 Recharge as well. And likely this is going to be around the $45,000 to $50,000 starting mark as a result. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the Ioniq 5 had a higher starting price than some of those other options, because the base model is going to have the bigger battery pack, 300 miles of range, something that you won't find in a base Mustang Mach-E, and a little bit more power than some of the less expensive EVs out there, and all of them are going to get the rapid DC fast charging that we see in this model, 10% to 80% in just 18 minutes. The Ioniq 5 might not be the EV for the masses, it might not be the most affordable EV out there, but it certainly is going to be one of the most interesting. And if you prefer the styling of the Kia EV6, it's going to be very closely related to this, have a lot of the same functions and features, but it's going to be wrapped in some very different, more sporty styling. Let me know which one you prefer down there in the comment section below, and stay tuned because I will be driving this a little bit later in 2021. I'll see all of you later.